In the sterile quietude of the intensive care unit, Leslie Dean's senses slowly began to stir as she unintentionally overheard fragments of her husband's hushed conversation on his phone. A chill ran through her as the words "the will" reached her ears, prompting her to adopt the guise of death, her breath shallow, her body motionless. Awareness tiptoed back to her, reluctant and gentle, as if fearful of the reality it brought with it. At first, it was as though she lingered in the comforting embrace of a deep, restorative sleep, adorned with dreams vibrant as a masterpiece crafted by an illustrious artist's fervent strokes. Bright yellow orbs, stark white triangles, and deep blue squares wove together in an intricate dance, forming elaborate patterns that resembled a mystical kaleidoscope, ever shifting and mesmerizing. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Leslie's sensations oscillated between extremes. Now she felt as if she were floating effortlessly in the cosmos, weightless and serene like a feather adrift in a tranquil breeze. Then, suddenly, the feeling would shift dramatically, a profound gravity anchoring her whole being, pulling her down into an overwhelming heaviness that seemed to tether her very soul to the depths of an unseen abyss. In this surreal, ghostly state, time became a meaningless concept, each moment stretching into eternity, blurring the boundaries between the ethereal and the tangible. Imprisoned in this liminal space, Leslie found herself unable to open her eyes, as if heavy veils of darkness were drawn tightly over her vision. Amidst this fog of half-consciousness, she began to hear a strange, beeping noise. It started as a distant echo, soft and elusive, barely more than a whisper in the vast silence. Gradually, it grew louder and clearer, transforming into a peculiar tone that evoked images of a distant, alien ship responding to some invisible, digital beacon, a call from the unknown, echoing across the void. Her awareness sharpened, pulling her gradually from the depths of oblivion towards the stark, glaring reality of awakening. It became unmistakably clear to Leslie that she was confined within the clinical, impersonal walls of a hospital room, the air thick with the sterile scent of disinfectants and the sharp, clinical odor of medications. Yet her eyelids remained stubbornly shut, as if sealed by some unseen force, resisting her desperate attempts to gaze upon the world around her. The ambient sounds of medical monitors and other life-sustaining machinery grew increasingly distinct, their rhythmic beeping merging with the steady pulse of her own heart, forming a bizarre symphony that underscored her fragile state. With great effort, Leslie marshaled the remnants of her strength and edged away from the shadowy brink of her previous state of unconsciousness. She became acutely aware of the oppressive heaviness of her body, now an unwilling host to a network of wires, tubes, and medical devices that bound her to this realm of clinical precision and cold lights. A harsh, blinding light assaulted her eyes from above, pressing down with an intensity that sparked an instinctive panic within her. What purpose did such glaring brightness serve in her fragile condition? In the corner of the room, a solitary blue light blinked incessantly, its rhythm seemingly counting down the moments of her life, a silent observer of her struggle between the worlds of light and shadow. Initially, Leslie found it difficult to make out the peculiar blue light that flickered intermittently at the edge of her vision. With her sight still obscured by a veil of blurriness, she wondered if this elusive glow was nothing more than a creation of her imagination, a phantom conjured up by her medicated and semi-conscious mind. Who could clarify this mystery for her in her isolated state? The abrupt sound of a door swinging open jolted Leslie, her reaction internal and hidden from the visible world. As the door clicked shut with a soft thud, a voice that she cherished deeply, a voice intertwined with countless memories and emotions, caused her heart to thump wildly against her chest. "So, how's our Leslie? Still in a coma?" "It's been almost 2 weeks now," said the familiar voice of her husband, Alfred Dean. Leslie focused intently, trying to absorb every word that floated to her ears. She realized Alfred wasn't alone. His words were likely directed towards a doctor or a member of the medical team, confirming her suspicions about her current surroundings. Well, Alfred, as you well know, the circumstances surrounding the delivery were quite severe. Triplets, a C-section, coupled with the fact that Lizzie's health was not optimal even before going into labor. We undertook a comprehensive series of tests, and frankly, the outcomes were quite disheartening. Even at that preliminary stage, replied a voice, undoubtedly that of a doctor, imbued with a mix of professional detachment and underlying concern. Lizzie's heartbeat accelerated further. A C-section. She was hit with the realization that she had indeed been pregnant. The shock of remembering such a significant life event left her reeling. How could she have forgotten she was about to become a mother to triplets? The cloud of heavy medications must be muddling her thoughts, but the pressing concern now was the whereabouts and well-being of her children. What had happened to them? Her mind, already fragile and fatigued, began to whirl with a flurry of anxious thoughts. The risk of complications from a multiple pregnancy was daunting, a responsibility and strain she felt deeply, compounded by the current mystery of her condition and the eerie, incomplete snippets of conversation that reached her ears. Lizzie's ears betrayed her just as her husband and the doctor's conversation was reaching its crux, her senses abruptly dulling once more, cutting her off from the world outside her mind. She lay there, a young mother shrouded in confusion and weakness, unable to comprehend why her return to consciousness went undetected. Why were the sophisticated sensors silent? Where were the highly touted hospital automation and the myriad of monitoring devices meant to alert the staff at the slightest change? Amid these questions, Alfred remained in the room, his presence a solitary figure beside her. Leslie strained against the fog of weakness that clouded her, trying to lift her eyelids that felt as heavy as lead. Well, lying down, Lizzie, go ahead, rest. No need to hurry, Alfred spoke in a tone laced with odd inflections, a cadence that stirred unease in Lizzie's slowly awakening mind. What does he mean by that? And why such a tone? Leslie puzzled internally, her thoughts swirling in a mix of confusion and dawning suspicion. Alfred, oblivious to his wife's emerging consciousness, spoke with unguarded candor, revealing his thoughts freely. The conversation lapsed into a heavy silence, spurring Lizzie to attempt a glance at her surroundings. But just as she managed to shift her gaze, the sterile quiet of the hospital room was shattered by the jarring trill of a cell phone. Peering through her semi-closed eyelids, Lizzie caught a glimpse of Alfred, adorned in a standard hospital gown and protective shoe covers. Underneath the gown, a flash of yellow, his shirt caught her eye, its vibrant hue clashing against the stark white of the hospital walls. This pop of color briefly lifted Lizzie's spirits, evoking memories of the lemon tree she nurtured back at home, its fruits as bright and vivid as the shirt Alfred wore. However, her momentary uplift was quickly soured by the grating ringtone emanating from Alfred's phone. Before she could fully tune into the harsh sound, Alfred swiftly answered the call, leaving Lizzie enveloped once again in her swirling thoughts and unanswered questions. Hello, Samantha, is that you? Yes, I'm so happy to hear your voice, and I love you deeply. We're at the hospital. Where else would we be? Yes, in the ICU. What else can be done here, lying helpless like this, with no idea when she'll wake from this coma? It's all working in my favor. You see, the kids? What about them? They'll go to the orphanage. That's where they belong. Lizzie's heart pounded in her chest, surging with indignation and disbelief. What is he saying? Is this some kind of nightmare or another dreadful vision? As her mind raced, her husband continued to speak softly with the woman whose name was meaningless to Lizzie. Samantha, let's not hurry things, okay? The will is already prepared. We just need to get a notary and a handwriting expert. We'll have to share the inheritance. You know how it is. Can't get anything done without a little persuasion. I'll forge the signature and then we can claim our money. And Lizzie can keep wandering in her alternate reality. We won't disconnect the machines just yet. Let her have a last breath of oxygen. Well, I have to go now, Samantha. I still need to sort out the kids' transfer to the orphanage. Yeah, okay, love you, kisses. Lizzie's entire being trembled with a mix of horror and sorrow. Her husband, once a man she trusted with her life, now plotting such vile deeds with another woman. Her mind whirled with the painful realization of betrayal and the desperate need to protect her children from a future she couldn't bear to imagine. This couldn't be real. It had to be some twisted illusion, yet every word stabbed at her soul with undeniable clarity. The weight of the conversation bore down on Lizzie, each sentence a hammer blow to her spirit. How could he speak so callously about their children, their innocent children who had already lost so much? Her thoughts spiraled into a chaotic frenzy, each one more desperate than the last. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to do anything to stop this monstrous plan from unfolding. But she was trapped in her own body, a prisoner to the coma that held her captive. Her husband, oblivious to her silent anguish, continued his conversation. Samantha, we have to be careful. Every step needs to be planned perfectly. We can't afford any mistakes. Once the notary and the expert are on board, it'll be smooth sailing. Leslie won't feel a thing. She's already gone in every way that matters. This is just a formality. And the kids, they'll be better off without this mess. An orphanage will give them what we can't: stability, routine, discipline. Tears of frustration and helplessness burned in Lizzie's eyes. How had it come to this? How had the man she loved turned into this cold, calculating stranger? Every memory of their life together, every promise and shared dream, now felt like a cruel mockery. She yearned to wake up, to confront him, to protect her children from the fate he was so casually consigning them to. But the coma held her in its merciless grip, rendering her a silent witness to her downfall. Her husband's voice softened, taking on a tone of tender affection that sickened her. Samantha, once this is all over, we'll be free. We can start anew, without all this baggage. I'll make sure the kids are settled before we leave. They won't remember this place, or us, in time. They'll adapt. Kids are resilient like that. Lizzie's mind screamed in protest, a silent wail of anguish that echoed through the corridors of her consciousness. She could not let this happen. She had to find a way to wake up, to fight back, to save her children from this nightmare. Every fiber of her being rebelled against the cruel fate being orchestrated around her. She clung to the hope that somehow, some way she would break free from the chains of the coma and stop this madness before it was too late. As her husband ended the call with Samantha, his words of love and promises of a future together rang hollow and bitter in Lizzie's ears. She knew she had to muster every ounce of strength, every shred of willpower, to pull herself back from the brink. For her children, for herself, for the life they deserved. The battle for her family's future had only just begun. Victoria carefully removed her apron and scarf, slipping into a worn-out jacket that had seen better days. In the dining hall, the waitresses continued their animated chatter, their voices mingling with the clinking of dishes. Justin was diligently tidying up his bar, but fortunately she wouldn't have to pass by him. The staff had a separate service exit, a small mercy on nights like this. Just as she stepped a few meters away from the restaurant, a voice called out to her. "Victoria, Victoria, wait." She paused, turning slightly as the bartender, Justin, came running after her, his jacket flapping open and his cap awkwardly sticking out of his pocket. He approached her, out of breath and looking strangely flustered. "Wait, Victoria," he repeated, catching his breath. "Hi, I wanted to apologize to you, and here, this is for you." He thrust a paper bag towards her, his movements hurried and almost nervous. Curious, Victoria sniffed the bag. A delightful aroma wafted up vanilla with a hint of cinnamon. There was also an enticing blend of rum and cocoa beans, the rich scent promising a treat far superior to the usual store-bought chocolates. "It's a chocolate cake," Justin explained, his voice softer now. "It wasn't ordered much today, so the pastry chefs gave it to me. Have it with some tea. It's delicious." A faint smile tugged at Victoria's lips. "Maybe you'll also have some," she suggested, a rare moment of invitation in her otherwise guarded demeanor. "Oh no, I've had enough at the bar." "Too much work today," Justin replied, rubbing his tired eyes. "I just thought you might like it." "Thank you," she said, nodding appreciatively. "I'll enjoy it." As she held the warm bag, she felt a rush of warmth spread through her. It had been a long time since anyone had given her something out of kindness without expecting anything in return. Her steps quickened as she hurried home, the poorly lit street and rough paths familiar under her feet. The chocolate cake was a simple gesture, but it filled her heart with an unexpected joy, a reminder that kindness could still find its way into her life. Leslie felt a profound sense of horror and disbelief wash over her after hearing those callous words. How could Alfred talk about her death so brazenly, right in her presence? And the children, what did they have to do with his twisted plans? The thought of sending her beloved kids to an orphanage was unthinkable, an act so devoid of conscience it left her reeling. Alfred lingered for a moment longer, then approached her, and with a cold detachment, took out his phone and snapped a picture of her with the flash. She had no idea why he would do such a thing. Watching his manipulations through half-closed eyes, Lizzie decided to feign death, hoping to let him think he had won, to let him revel in his moment of triumph and falsely believe he could take what belonged to others. But deep inside, Lizzie made a silent vow. "I will survive no matter what. I'll fight back, and then I'll hold my children to my chest," she repeated to herself like a mantra. She could almost feel the intensity of her husband's gaze, standing mere inches away, relishing the sight of her supposed demise. A sardonic smirk curled on Alfred's lips, a chilling indication of his satisfaction. Finally, having indulged his curiosity, he shuffled out of the room, moving with the slow gait of an old man. The tension of the shocking encounter left Lizzie drenched in sweat, her throat dry like someone stranded in a vast, merciless desert. Her tongue felt like sandpaper against her palate as she struggled to give some sign of life. In movies, it always shows that when someone comes out of a coma, alarms blare and monitors flash with all the colors of the rainbow, from red to yellow and green. But the reality was far less dramatic. Just then, the door to the ward creaked open again, and she heard the sound of cautious, hesitant footsteps approaching. Probably a nurse, she thought. If it were a doctor, he would enter with more confidence and a steady stride. As the footsteps drew nearer, Lizzie dared to open her eyes just a sliver, only to realize she was wrong. A young doctor, looking somewhat embarrassed and unsure, stood before her, frequently glancing down at the notes in his notepad. The young doctor's presence was a stark contrast to the sinister atmosphere left by Alfred. He looked at her with genuine concern, a stark difference from the cold detachment she had just endured. He noticed the beads of sweat on her forehead and the dryness of her lips. "Mrs. Lizzie, can you hear me?" he asked softly, his voice filled with a mixture of professional calm and personal empathy. Leslie wanted to respond, to cry out for help, but her voice felt trapped in the arid desert of her throat. She managed a slight nod, a tiny movement that seemed monumental in her weakened state. The doctor's eyes lit up with hope and determination. "You're going to be okay, Mrs. Lizzie. We're here to help you," he assured her, taking her hand gently in his. At that moment, a glimmer of hope sparked within her. She wasn't alone in this fight. With the doctor's help, she would find the strength to reclaim her life and protect her children. The path ahead was fraught with challenges, but Lizzie's resolve was unwavering. She would overcome this ordeal, rise from the ashes of betrayal, and ensure that her children never faced the grim future Alfred had planned for them. As the young doctor began to check her vitals and ensure she was stable, Lizzie's mind was already racing with thoughts of survival and justice. She knew that this was just the beginning of her journey back to life, but she was ready to face whatever came her way. "Oh, what is this? Did I do something wrong?" Leslie, mustering all her courage, opened her eyes and immediately locked onto the doctor's gaze. He smiled, a look of relief spreading across his face, and was about to speak when the door flew open and a panting resuscitator rushed in. "Edward, you're at it again. Look at what you've done. The equipment's gone haywire. Why did I ever agree to take you on as an intern? I can't stand the sight of you. Where do your hands grow from?" Edward, visibly embarrassed and flustered, glanced furtively at Lizzie. Then, as if unable to contain himself, he blurted out, "She came out of the coma." The resuscitator's attention immediately switched to the patient. Indeed, it was an extraordinarily unusual day. This incident should remain private, as both Edward and the resuscitator had families and children. Moments later, Edward, still shaking from the excitement, found himself at the door of the maternity ward. The duty nurse, noticing the handsome young intern, asked, "Well, what do you need here? Aren't you doing your internship in intensive care?" Edward smiled shyly and then said, "A patient asked me to check on her babies, Leslie. Do you know her?" Karen smiled warmly. "Of course I know her. Triplets, you know. It's hard to forget something like that. In all my years here, it's never happened, so it's quite the sensation for our ward. They say it's even going to be in the local newspaper and on TV." Edward shrugged in confusion. "What's the big deal? Triplets are just triplets." Karen pursed her plump lips indignantly. "You don't know the most important part. She got pregnant through artificial insemination. That is, with material taken from a special genetic data bank. Have you heard of that?" "I've heard of it, but I haven't dealt with it personally and haven't thought about it," Edward replied. The nurse smiled knowingly. "Well, you should think about it. It's a good thing, especially when the husband can't have children." Meanwhile, back in her hospital room, Lizzie was absorbing the reality of her miraculous awakening. The conversation between Edward and the resuscitator played over in her mind, but she couldn't shake the memory of Alfred's cold, calculated words. Determination surged within her. She had to protect her children, her precious triplets, from the nefarious plans of her husband. She knew now that she was not alone and that the universe had given her a second chance to fight for her family. Lizzie's thoughts were interrupted by the gentle knock on the door. The young doctor, Edward, entered with a cautious yet hopeful expression. "Mrs. Lizzie, you're doing remarkably well. How are you feeling?" I feel like I've been given a new lease on life," Lizzie replied, her voice still weak but filled with newfound resolve. "I need to see my children. I need to hold them." Edward nodded, understanding the urgency in her voice. "Of course, Mrs. Lizzie. We'll arrange it right away. Your children are beautiful and healthy, and they're waiting for you." As Edward left to make the necessary arrangements, Lizzie closed her eyes, silently thanking whatever force had brought her back. She knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she was ready to face them. With the support of kind souls like Edward and Karen, she would navigate this storm and emerge stronger, ready to reclaim her life and protect her children from any harm. Edward, meanwhile, returned to the maternity ward, where Karen greeted him with a smile. "So what's the latest with Leslie?" she asked. "She's awake and wants to see her babies," Edward replied, a smile of his forming. "It's incredible. She's been through so much, but she's a fighter." Karen nodded, her eyes glistening with admiration. "Mothers are the strongest people I know, and those triplets are lucky to have her." Now let's make sure they get to see their amazing mom. Together, Edward and Karen set off to reunite Leslie with her children, a testament to the power of hope, resilience, and the unwavering strength of a mother's love. Edward didn't comment on Karen's remark, but instead asked for directions to the room he needed to go to. Understanding that the conversation was over, Karen provided him with detailed instructions on where to go and how to get there. As he walked away, she called after him, "Edward, wait. Listen, the father is visiting the kids, so you better wait by the door and enter later." But Edward, eager to fulfill Lizzie's request, didn't hear Karen's last words. He hurried back to his ward, knowing that if William noticed his absence, there would be no avoiding a scandal. Arguing with the head of the department was unwise, especially since William held the keys to his future placement, and Edward dreamed of working at the city's prestigious First Hospital. He was confident in his abilities, but had no desire to be sent to a provincial area. As Edward approached the door, he was about to enter when he overheard a heated conversation. One of the voices belonged to Alfred, and the other was presumably the head of the obstetrics department, Dr. Michael Bennett. Alfred's voice was loud and commanding, typical of someone used to getting his way. "Listen to me, Michael. My wife Lizzie is in intensive care, still in a coma, and we don't know if she'll ever wake up. This whole pregnancy thing was doomed from the start. I was always against it." "Doctor," Bennett gasped in surprise. "What do you mean you were against it? Didn't you know your wife was planning to get pregnant using bank genetic material?" Realizing he had revealed too much, Alfred quickly backtracked. "Of course I knew. I just didn't like it, that's all. The doctors warned us that Lizzie's health wasn't great. Her blood clotting was poor, but she decided to go through with it. Then triplets, a C-section, anesthesia, you understand the risks involved." Michael Bennett looked at Alfred intently. "So what are you proposing? Abandon the children, leave them in a nursery. Why start this in the first place?" Alfred smiled disingenuously. "Circumstances were different then, but now everything has changed. If my wife doesn't come out of the coma, I'll be practically a widower. Why would I want that burden? Besides, I genuinely don't know what to do with the infants. Let them stay in the nursery for now, and if or when Leslie recovers, we'll take them back." Edward's heart pounded as he listened to the conversation. The implications of Alfred's words were chilling. He felt a surge of anger and a fierce protective instinct for Lizzie and her children. He knew he had to act carefully, but he couldn't stand by and let this man dictate the fate of those innocent babies. Taking a deep breath, Edward pushed the door open just a crack, enough to see Alfred's face twisted in frustration. "Doctor." Bennett stood his ground, his expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Alfred, these are your children. You can't just abandon them because the situation is inconvenient for you. What kind of father does that?" Alfred's face darkened, a practical one. "I have responsibilities and a business to run. I can't be saddled with 3 infants on my own." Edward couldn't stay silent any longer. He stepped into the room, his voice steady and filled with resolve. "Mr. Alfred, I believe it's time for you to leave. Your presence here isn't helping Lizzie or the children." Alfred turned, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Edward. "Who do you think you are, telling me what to do? This is my family, my decision." Edward met his gaze without flinching. "I'm someone who cares about their well-being, and right now you're only adding to their distress. Please leave." "Doctor." Bennett nodded in agreement. "Edward is right. This conversation isn't productive. Alfred, it's best if you go and let us take care of Lizzie and the children." Alfred glared at both of them, but finally turned on his heel and left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Edward felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he watched him go. "Doctor." Bennett turned to Edward with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Edward. That took courage. Now, let's focus on what's important: Lizzie and her babies. Edward nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Together, they would ensure that Lizzie received the care and support she needed, and that her children would be safe and loved. As he walked towards the maternity ward, he felt a surge of determination. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to face it head-on. For Lizzie, for her children, and the promise of a better future. Edward almost pounded the wall in frustration, muttering under his breath, "My God, how is this possible? These are babies, so what if they're not biologically his? He's still fully responsible for them." Fortunately, the head of the department wasn't willing to give up so easily either. "No, young man, I don't think you'll find an ally in me. We do help people who are in dire financial straits or something similar, marginalized people, or those without a permanent home. But you're a wealthy man. Why are you doing this? Surely you have the money to support triplets." Sensing resistance, Alfred persisted. "You might be overestimating my capabilities, Michael. If you've forgotten, all the assets are in my wife's name, and she's in a coma now. So I want to place the children in the nursery. I'm sure they'll be better off there with professionals. And I promise to support your department and the nursery too if you want. I'll arrange for the necessary funds to be transferred to your account right now. I'm not abandoning them entirely. It will be like hiring a specialized nanny, but instead of one nanny, there will be several. And the children will be in a special facility under reliable supervision. Meanwhile, I can focus on my business and caring for my sick wife without obstacles." The head of the department pondered for a moment. Meanwhile, Edward, boiling with anger, couldn't contain himself and burst into the room. "Excuse me," he began, "but I accidentally overheard part of your conversation. Believe me, you don't know the whole truth. The fact is, Lizzie has already regained consciousness, and it looks like she's going to be fine. So now only she as the mother can decide whether to give the children up to the orphanage or not." Alfred snorted indignantly. "And who are you? A doctor or an orderly? A scarecrow who gave you the right to barge in here?" Edward struggled to control his emotions and then smiled. "Me? I'm an intern who wants to help people, and I'm sure Lizzie will make the right decision, unlike you." Michael waved his hands in protest. "All right, stop it. This is a ward for newborns, not a place for squabbles. Take your disputes outside. I won't be filing any papers, and I advise you not to either. If you persist, I'll have to call the police to determine whether you can care for the children or not." Alfred glared at Edward with hatred, then stormed out of the room, slamming the door loudly. The head of the department looked at the young intern with a friendly expression, as he knew his parents well and held no grudge. "Did you need something, Edward?" The young man hesitated for a moment, then explained Lizzie's request, stammering over every word. By the end, the head of the department was smiling broadly. "Well, as I said, any normal mother would never give up her children. Whether she's poor or rich, doesn't matter. And you, Edward, go ahead and take pictures, even videos if you like. I'm not against it. The fact that she came out of the coma is a good sign. Fate itself is telling us to keep the children with their mother. She'll get better, and we'll bring the babies to her ward as she still can't get up." Edward sighed with relief and got to work. The head of the department, after a brief pause, tactfully left the room to let the young man fulfill the mother's request. Edward felt a sense of triumph and duty as he snapped photos and took videos of the babies, making sure to capture every precious detail. He knew these images would bring immense joy and hope to Lizzie. Back in the ICU, Lizzie lay in her bed, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. She had overheard bits of the conversation between Alfred and Dr. Bennett, and her heart ached with the realization of her husband's betrayal. But Edward's voice, firm and compassionate, had given her a glimmer of hope. She knew she wasn't alone in this fight. Edward returned to Lizzie's ward with a gentle knock, carrying a tablet filled with pictures and videos of her babies. "Mrs. Lizzie, I have something for you," he said softly, approaching her bedside. He showed her the images, and tears welled up in her eyes as she saw her beautiful children. They were healthy, vibrant, and so full of life. "Thank you, Edward," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for everything." Edward smiled, his own eyes misting over. "It's the least I could do. You have incredible strength, Mrs. Lizzie. We're all here to support you and your children." As Leslie looked at the images of her babies, she felt a renewed sense of determination. She would fight for them, for their future, and for the life they deserved. No matter the obstacles, she would not give up. She had allies in this hospital, and together, they would ensure that her children remained with their mother, where they belonged. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Lizzie knew she was ready to face whatever challenges came her way. With Edward's unwavering support and the dedication of the hospital staff, she would rebuild her life and protect her children from harm. And as she held on to that hope, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the kindness and compassion of those around her. Seeing the trio of rosy-cheeked babies, Edward smiled and realized he might have chosen the wrong field of medicine. Perhaps he should have become an obstetrician. He hadn't realized how much he loved babies and everything related to them. After taking a few pictures and a short video, Edward hurried back. It seemed everything had gone smoothly, but as he was passing through the corridor near the intensive care unit, William intercepted him with a triumphant look. "Where have you been wandering off to again, Edward? I see you want to end up on an internship in the provinces. Be careful, or I'll make sure your life gets interesting. If you fail this practicum, I'll personally ensure you get placed as an intern in the morgue. There. You won't cause any trouble. That's the last stop. It's not the nicest place. Smells like disinfectant all the time, cold, constant sniffles, and bronchitis. It's a resort. But I want to become a resuscitation doctor, William. I've told you that." The head of the department smiled. So what? All right, first of all, I'm reprimanding you for not being at your place during working hours. Now hurry up and go to the department, walk through the wards, and see what's going on there. Note all the changes in the patient's conditions constantly, or you'll never learn anything. Edward nodded obediently and trudged off. His mood noticeably worsened. The conversation with William was to blame for everything, but Lizzie liked the pictures of the babies. Tears welled up in her eyes as she smiled at the young intern, ready to worship him for his service. "Oh, no need to thank me. I just did it out of the kindness of my heart. You asked, and I delivered, although your husband came into the ward. He seemed strange and wanted to send the children to a nursery, but the head of the department opposed it and stood up for the babies. Michael is a good man," Edward said. Leslie looked at Edward with fear. How could Alfred want to send the children to a nursery? "I asked you not to do anything without me," she said. Edward nodded in agreement. "Yes, I know you said so. He just decided to act on his own. He doesn't know yet that you've come out of your coma." Leslie thanked Edward again for his help, then sank into painful reflection. The realization that her husband was willing to discard their children like unwanted burdens gnawed at her soul. The man she had once trusted with her life was now a stranger, driven by selfishness and greed. She felt a renewed sense of urgency to recover fully and reclaim her role as their protector. Meanwhile, Edward, still feeling the sting of William's reprimand, made his rounds through the department. He dutifully checked on patients, noting any changes in their conditions, but his mind kept drifting back to Leslie and her babies. The emotional toll of the day's events weighed heavily on him, but he remained steadfast in his determination to help her. Back in her room, Lizzie clung to the images of her children. They were her light, her reason to fight. She vowed to muster every ounce of strength to recover and bring her family back together. The betrayal by Alfred only fueled her resolve. She wouldn't let him or anyone else dictate the fate of her precious babies. As the day turned into evening, Edward found himself standing outside Lizzie's room again. He hesitated, then knocked softly before entering. Leslie looked up, her eyes tired but filled with gratitude. "Edward, I can't thank you enough for what you've done. Those pictures, they mean everything to me." Edward smiled warmly. "It's the least I could do, Mrs. Lizzie. You have incredible strength, and I know you'll get through this. Your children are lucky to have you as their mother." Leslie nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I have to get better for them. I can't let Alfred take them away." "You won't have to," Edward reassured her. "We'll make sure of that. Doctor, Bennett and I will do everything we can to support you." As Edward left her room, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the path ahead would be challenging, but he was committed to helping Lizzie and her children. He would fight alongside her, ensuring that they stayed together and that justice prevailed. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Lizzie's condition steadily improved, and she gained more strength each day. Edward continued to visit her, providing updates on her children and offering words of encouragement. The bond between them grew, united by their shared goal of protecting her family. In the background, Alfred's attempts to manipulate the situation were thwarted by Dr. Bennett's steadfast opposition. The head of the department made it clear that the hospital would not support Alfred's plans, and any further attempts to place the children in a nursery would be met with legal action. One afternoon, as Lizzie held the pictures of her babies close, Edward entered the room with a special surprise. "Mrs. Lizzie, I have something that I think will lift your spirits," he said, his eyes twinkling with excitement. He handed her a small video player. Leslie pressed play and watched as the screen came to life with images of her triplets, cooing and gurgling. Her heart swelled with love and hope as she saw their tiny faces, their rosy cheeks, and their bright eyes. "Thank you, Edward," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "This means the world to me." Edward smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. "You're welcome, Mrs. Lizzie. We'll keep fighting together." As the days turned into weeks, Lizzie's recovery continued. She grew stronger, both physically and emotionally, and with Edward and Dr. Bennett's support, she was ready to take on the challenges ahead. She knew that her fight was far from over, but she also knew that she wasn't alone. With her babies as her guiding light and her newfound allies by her side, Lizzie faced the future with courage and determination. She would protect her children, reclaim her life, and ensure that the bond between them remained unbroken, no matter what obstacles lay in their path. She had never doubted that Alfred betrayed her, and essentially she was to blame for it. Being a wealthy businesswoman, she had taken under her wing a snake in the form of her future husband from the local cooperative, which once worked under her leadership. Before meeting Leslie, Alfred was nothing special. He led an ordinary life, like a rolling stone. He never stayed anywhere for long, constantly changed jobs, and always needed money. Leslie, on the other hand, rose from scratch. She accidentally started fishing when, at the dawn of her business career, she learned that she could buy shares of the local fish processing plant at a bargain price. She even had to take out a loan from the bank to buy the enterprise, which eventually paid off handsomely, several times over. Under her leadership, fishing in the region flourished again and began to bring in a consistently high income. Furthermore, along the entire coast, tourist zones with a couple of good hotels and a network of snack bars appeared. But the most amazing thing was that Lizzie never considered herself too rich to flaunt her status. Like before, she drove a modest car and had no security or servants in her own home, but Alfred, settling in a luxurious residence, immediately insisted on a major overhaul and hiring servants and security. Leslie always took care of everything in the house herself, cleaning, cooking delicious dinners, and even fighting the leaves in her yard and adjacent area. Alfred, however, wanted luxury and wealth, which he had never seen in his life. Given the opportunity to access his wife's financial assets, he became obsessed with it once and for all. Leslie wasn't sure who Samantha was, the person her husband was talking to on the phone, although she suspected that she was probably one of the assistants working at one of the coastal hotels. A year ago, when Leslie found out that Alfred couldn't have children, she didn't divorce him and offered an alternative solution, getting pregnant artificially. Alfred took this proposal badly, and Leslie frowned. "How can you talk about children like that? It will be my child. Do you understand? The one I carry from conception to birth," Alfred just scoffed skeptically, but Leslie paid no attention to it. She didn't even realize that she had already made a very big mistake in her life by agreeing to this marriage, because back then, Alfred was completely different, talking about how he loved children and dreamed of having both a boy and a girl in their family. Now, however, consumed by wealth and luxury, he only thought about his enrichment and nothing else. Leslie considered this extravagance, knowing the value of money and how hard it was to earn it. Those who knew her personally understood what a lonely woman had to go through before achieving financial independence. Unfortunately, only now did Leslie face the consequences of a rash choice. Alfred betrayed his wife and planned to forge her will, thinking she would never wake up from her coma. "No, Alfred, you've miscalculated here. We'll fight. My children and I will fight. Mark my words," thought Leslie, gritting her teeth. At that very moment, in a fit of anger, the husband rushed out of the hospital building and headed towards his car, where Samantha patiently waited for him. Sitting in the hospital bed, Leslie reflected on the series of events that had led her to this moment. She had always prided herself on her ability to make sound decisions, but marrying Alfred had been a monumental mistake. His charm had blinded her to his true nature, a man driven by greed and an insatiable desire for luxury. It was a harsh lesson learned too late, but now she had to focus on what mattered most: her children. The memories of their life together played like a cruel film in her mind. Alfred had always put on a facade of a loving husband, but his true intentions had always been clear to those who looked closely enough. He had never been satisfied with the simple, hard-working life Leslie cherished. Instead, he craved opulence and status, things that meant nothing to her. Leslie had always been content with her modest lifestyle, despite her immense wealth. She found joy in the simple pleasures: a well-cooked meal, a clean home, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. But Alfred's incessant demands for more had been a constant source of tension. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Edward entering the room again. "Leslie, I just wanted to check on you and see if you need anything," he said softly, his concern evident in his eyes. Leslie forced a smile, grateful for his kindness. "Thank you, Edward. You've already done so much. Just knowing my babies are safe is more than I could ask for." Edward nodded, his expression serious. "We'll make sure they're always safe. You have my word." As Edward left the room, Leslie's resolve hardened. She knew she had allies in the hospital, people who would stand by her and help her protect her children. She would recover, she would fight, and she would ensure that Alfred's plans never came to fruition. Outside, Alfred slammed the car door shut, his face contorted with rage. Samantha looked at him questioningly, but he simply shook his head. "Let's go," he muttered. "We have work to do." Samantha nodded, but a flicker of doubt crossed her face. She had been drawn into Alfred's world of deception and greed, but now she wondered if she had made the right choice. The sight of Leslie's babies had stirred something within her, a pang of guilt she couldn't quite shake. As they drove away, Alfred's mind raced with plans and schemes. He refused to accept that his carefully constructed house of cards was collapsing. He would find a way to get what he wanted, no matter the cost. But back in the hospital, A different kind of strength was being forged. Leslie, weakened but not defeated, prepared for the battle ahead. With her children as her driving force and the support of those who believed in her, she would reclaim her life and protect her family from the man who had betrayed her so profoundly. The road ahead was long and fraught with challenges, but Lizzie was ready. She would not let Alfred win. She would fight with every ounce of her being, for herself, for her children, and for the life they deserved. Ironically, Lizzie was not mistaken and accurately guessed Samantha's professional affiliation. Samantha indeed worked as a chambermaid in one of the hotels, and she envied her employer with bitter hatred. Seeing her agitated lover, she immediately asked, "So is there anything to celebrate?" "Did it all work out?" Alfred shook his head negatively. "No, it's much worse." She woke up. I didn't go to her again. The second time I had enough of what I saw. She's barely breathing, all pale. I thought she had a day, maybe two, left. I rushed the notary to make the will properly so that everything would come to us. And then you see how everything turned upside down. What turned upside down? Did everything collapse? The dyed blonde exclaimed indignantly. Reluctantly, Alfred continued. "Well, yeah, I wanted to assign the children to the nursery today, but the head of the department went ballistic and made such a scandal. I barely got away with my feet intact." With concern, Samantha looked at her lover. "Well, I told you. You should have gotten rid of these pests right away. You could have refused on the day of delivery, written a disclaimer in the first few hours. And that's it." But who knew that Lizzie would come to her senses so quickly? I was getting information from the head nurse. She said that with her body's peculiarities, she could stay in a coma for a year, and in a year, we would have had crumbs left from her inheritance. After chatting a little more, the couple indulged in a passionate kiss, unaware that at that very moment, Mark Johnson was carefully watching them, shaking his head disapprovingly. The janitor took the broom in his hands and headed to the opposite side of the yard. Mark had always been an observant man, and he had seen enough to know that something was seriously amiss. He had a good heart and a strong sense of justice, and he decided that he couldn't let this slide. Inside the hospital, Lizzie lay in bed, her mind racing. She knew she had to be smart about this. Alfred was cunning and dangerous, but she had something he didn't: the truth and a mother's love for her children. She wouldn't let him get away with his treachery. She would find a way to protect her family, no matter the cost. As she drifted into an uneasy sleep, her thoughts kept returning to the kind faces of Edward and Dr. Bennett. They had stood by her when she was at her weakest, and that gave her hope. She knew she could count on them as she navigated the treacherous path ahead. Edward, meanwhile, was making his rounds, but his mind kept drifting back to Leslie and her situation. He felt a deep sense of responsibility to help her. He knew that as an intern, there was only so much he could do, but he was determined to find a way to support her. He would speak to Dr. Bennett and see if there was anything more they could do. As the night fell, the hospital quieted down, but the tension remained palpable. Alfred and Samantha, oblivious to the growing storm, continued their scheming, but they had no idea that forces were aligning against them. Mark Johnson, with his quiet determination, began to formulate a plan of his own. He would gather evidence and ensure that Alfred's true nature was exposed. The next morning, Leslie awoke with a renewed sense of determination. She requested a meeting with Dr. Bennett and Edward, ready to share her story and seek their counsel. Together, they began to devise a plan to protect her children and bring Alfred to justice. Days turned into weeks, and Lizzie's strength grew. She worked tirelessly with her newfound allies, gathering evidence and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Alfred continued his attempts to manipulate the situation, but he found himself increasingly thwarted by the unexpected resistance he faced. One evening, as Alfred and Samantha sat in their car, discussing their next move, they were startled by a knock on the window. Mark Johnson stood there, holding a folder. "I think you should take a look at this," he said, his voice steady and resolute. Alfred snatched the folder from Mark's hands, his face darkening as he flipped through the pages. Samantha's expression turned to one of horror as she realized the extent of their exposure. Mark had documented everything, from their conversations to their attempts to manipulate Lizzie's will. "You can't do this," Alfred snarled, but Mark remained unfazed. "It's already done," Mark replied calmly. "I've made copies. This is just the beginning." Back in the hospital, Leslie felt a sense of peace for the first time in months. She knew the battle was far from over, but she also knew she wasn't fighting alone. With Edward, Dr. Bennett, and even the unassuming janitor Mark on her side, she felt a renewed sense of hope. Alfred and Samantha's world began to crumble as the truth came to light. The legal battle was arduous, but with the overwhelming evidence against them, their fate was sealed. Leslie emerged victorious, not just for herself, but for her children. As she held her babies close, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the unlikely heroes who had come to her aid. The road had been long and fraught with challenges, but together they had overcome. Leslie knew that no matter what the future held, she was ready to face it, surrounded by those who truly cared. Today's shift dragged on for Edward as if it were made of rubber. His mood remained dismal, tainted by the incident in the maternity ward and the subsequent reprimand from William. Essentially, Edward understood that he hadn't done anything wrong, but on the other hand, his actions warranted criticism from the boss, who would now decide whether Edward deserved to work in this department or not. Additionally, the young intern feared the judgment of his parents. Although they weren't his biological parents, he had long considered them the closest people in the world. What if his father said that his adopted son proved unworthy of the trust placed in him? His mother wouldn't criticize him, of course, but she would surely shed a tear and sigh sadly, and Edward's heart would ache with pity. After waiting for the end of his shift, he changed clothes and quickly left the intensive care unit. At that moment, a familiar male voice called out to him. "Hey, where are you off to?" Edward turned around and shook his head ruefully. "Oh, sorry, Mark. I got a bit distracted." "Of course, I'll take the foundling. Let me bring it here," taking the box from the janitor's hands. The guy looked inside and smiled happily. There indeed sat a little puppy, amusingly sniffing from side to side and noisily inhaling the air. "You know, be sure to pamper him with milk for the first time, okay? And don't give him anything solid yet. If you want to buy something, there are special puppy canned foods in the store. They're a bit pricier, but I think you won't eat too much anyway. And if you don't know something, it's better to ask." "All right," Mark asked with a smile. "Of course I'll do everything. Don't worry. If anything, I know how to treat people, so I'll manage with the puppy," Edward replied eagerly. Mark breathed a sigh of relief and added as Edward walked away, "Well, God willing, God willing. All right, son, see you later." Taking the box in his hands, Edward quickly headed towards the nearest bus stop. Passers-by looked at the tall young man carrying a strange burden. However, Edward didn't mind anymore because he had experienced so many unexpected events that day that he was ready for anything. Fortunately, the landlord agreed to let the guy keep the puppy in the rented house, which he promptly named Max. "Well, Max, ready to eat? I'll pour you some milk now, crumble some bread in it, and you'll have lunch rather than dinner," Edward said with a smile. Soon, a small bowl of warm milk and soft bread, giving the substance the necessary thickness, was placed in front of the fluffy pup. Watching Max eagerly enjoy the treat, Edward found himself disliking Leslie's husband, Alfred. He behaved too arrogantly in the hospital and considered himself the master of the situation, though in reality, it was quite the opposite, and he certainly wasn't one at that very moment. Meanwhile, Leslie was contemplating her next move. Firstly, through the duty orderly, Shirley, she asked to bring her phone and hold it to her ear. The girl looked embarrassed, but seeing the pleading gaze in Lizzie's eyes, she agreed. "All right, just make sure William doesn't see," she said, then hurried off to the nursing station where she kept her purse with a smartphone. Returning to Lizzie, she dialed the necessary number under her dictation and handed the phone to the patient's ear. Leslie took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Hello." "Mom." "It's me, Leslie," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "Leslie. Oh my God, are you okay? We've been so worried," her mother exclaimed, relief flooding her voice. "I'm awake now, Mom. I'm getting stronger, but I need your help. Alfred, he's trying to take the children away. He wants to put them in a nursery, and I can't let that happen. I need you to come here, to the hospital, and help me, please." Her mother didn't hesitate. "Of course, Leslie. I'll be there as soon as I can. We'll fight this together." Leslie felt a wave of relief wash over her. She knew that with her mother's support, she had a fighting chance. After ending the call, she handed the phone back to Shirley. "Thank you," she said, gratitude shining in her eyes. Shirley nodded. "You're welcome, Leslie. We'll make sure Alfred doesn't get away with this." As the evening turned into night, Edward settled Max into his new home, his thoughts still revolving around Lizzie's predicament. He knew he had to talk to Dr. Bennett about what had happened and see if there was anything more they could do to help. The bond he felt with Lizzie and her children had grown stronger, and he was determined to see this through. The next morning, Edward found Dr. Bennett in his office. "Dr. Bennett, do you have a moment?" he asked, entering the room. Dr. Bennett looked up from his paperwork and nodded. "Of course, Edward. What's on your mind?" Edward took a deep breath and explained everything that had transpired: Alfred's attempts to put the children in a nursery, his confrontation with Alfred, and Lizzie's determination to fight back. Dr. Bennett listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each word. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Edward. I had my suspicions about Alfred, but this confirms them. We'll need to take steps to protect Lizzie and her children. I'll speak to the hospital administration and make sure they are aware of the situation. In the meantime, continue to support Lizzie and keep me informed of any developments." Edward nodded, feeling a sense of relief. "I will, Dr. Bennett. Thank you." As Edward left the office, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would do everything in his power to help Lizzie and ensure her children were safe. The battle was far from over, but with allies like Dr. Bennett and his determination, he was confident they could overcome the challenges ahead. Lizzie's mother arrived at the hospital later that day, her face etched with worry, but also with determination. She embraced her daughter, tears of relief streaming down her face. "We'll get through this, Lizzie, I promise." With her mother by her side and the support of Edward and Dr. Bennett, Lizzie felt stronger than ever. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready to face it head-on. She would protect her children, reclaim her life, and ensure that Alfred's plans never came to fruition. As the days passed, Lizzie continued to gain strength, both physically and emotionally. With each passing day, her resolve grew stronger, fueled by her love for her children and the unwavering support of those around her. She knew that no matter what obstacles lay ahead, she would not give up. She would fight for her family, for her future, and for the life they deserved. As it turned out, shortly after, the businesswoman called her family notary, whom she had known for many years. The directive was clear: in the event of her death, all assets should be placed into a specific bank account, the details of which only a select few would know, and she completely ruled out any possibility of editing or making adjustments. This was done not by chance, but to protect herself from Alfred's subsequent actions. Alan Smith listened with his characteristic calmness and then said, "I'll take care of everything. You don't have to worry." "Leslie, your husband's schemes won't lead to anything good. Mark my words." Leslie thanked him and ended the call. She then looked at Shirley with a mysterious glance and asked, "Listen, Shirley, what's that small blue box glowing over there in the corner? Do you see?" The orderly turned around and noticed in the upper right corner of the room a miniature device directed at the patient's bed. "Oh, that? It's a hidden surveillance camera," Shirley exclaimed in surprise. Recently, all the rooms in the ICU were equipped with these cameras. You know, anything can happen. Patients can come to their senses and fall out of bed. Leslie nodded understandingly and immediately asked the question that worried her. "So if desired, can you watch videos from them?" Shirley nodded in agreement. "Yeah, I suppose you can, but the recording isn't stored with me. It's with William, the head of the department. It's his responsibility. He always wanted to control the whole process from home. So we're strict about it here in the department. We're busy all day like busy bees because we never know exactly where the camera is placed, and you, I see, have sharp eyes. Noticed it right away." Leslie smiled. "I have several of those myself. Well, at the docks where the fish shipments happen and all that, so I know a thing or two about cameras." Shirley chuckled. "Well, that explains it. But if you need to review the footage, you'll have to get William's approval. He's quite particular about the security protocols." Leslie nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Shirley. I might just do that." After Shirley left the room, Lizzie's mind raced with the possibilities. If there were recordings of Alfred's visits, she could use them to prove his intentions and protect her children. She decided that speaking with William would be her next step. She needed to convince him to allow her to access the surveillance footage. Meanwhile, Alfred and Samantha continued their deceitful plans, unaware of the unfolding events back at the hospital. As they plotted their next moves, the seeds of their eventual downfall were already being sown. Later that afternoon, Lizzie requested a meeting with William. When he entered her room, she greeted him with a determined expression. "William, I need your help," she began. "I understand the ICU rooms are equipped with surveillance cameras, and I believe the footage could be crucial in protecting my children from my husband's malicious plans." William raised an eyebrow. "Leslie, I'm aware of your situation, but accessing surveillance footage is a serious matter. It's not something we do lightly." "I understand that, William. But my husband has been plotting against me, and I believe the recordings will prove his intentions. I need to protect my children, and this might be the only way." William sighed, considering her words. "All right, Lizzie, I'll review the footage myself and see if there's anything relevant. If I find anything, I'll let you know, but I can't promise anything beyond that." "Thank you, William. That's all I ask," Lizzie replied, her gratitude evident. As William left the room, Lizzie felt a glimmer of hope. She knew that having the head of the department on her side could make all the difference. She just had to wait and see what the footage revealed. In the meantime, Edward continued to visit Leslie, offering his support and encouragement. He brought updates on her children, who were thriving under the care of the hospital staff. Each visit strengthened Lizzie's resolve to fight for her family. A few days later, William returned to Lizzie's room with a serious expression. "Leslie, I've reviewed the footage. You were right. There's evidence that your husband has been plotting against you. I've seen his interactions with the staff and his attempts to place your children in the nursery." Lizzie's heart raced. "Thank you, William. This means so much to me. What should we do next?" "We'll need to take this to the hospital administration and possibly involve legal authorities," William replied. "But rest assured, we'll do everything we can to protect you and your children." With William's help, Lizzie began to take the necessary steps to safeguard her family. Legal proceedings were initiated against Alfred, and the hospital administration provided additional security measures to ensure her safety. As the weeks passed, Leslie grew stronger, both physically and emotionally. With the support of Edward, William, and her mother, she prepared for the legal battle ahead. Alfred and Samantha, on the other hand, found themselves increasingly cornered as their schemes unraveled. In the end, justice prevailed. Alfred's plans were exposed, and he faced the consequences of his actions. Leslie, with her children by her side, emerged victorious. She had fought tirelessly to protect her family, and her efforts had paid off. As she looked at her children, Leslie felt a profound sense of relief and gratitude. She knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges, but she was ready to face them with the unwavering support of her loved ones. Together they would build a future filled with love, hope, and resilience. Shirley replied respectfully to the businesswoman. Leslie cautiously continued, "I noticed it right away, just hesitated to ask and didn't have the strength, but now I need that recording. In short, Shirley, call William for me. I need to talk to him." Shirley nodded in agreement and hurried to fulfill the request, and within 5 minutes, the head of the department was already in the room. After attentively looking into the patient's eyes, he asked, "Did you need something, Lacey?" In response, she winked meaningfully and slowly recounted the essence of her request to him. William listened silently, but when he caught the main point, he understood that there was sense in the patient's words. "Yes, I think I can help you. Usually, recordings are updated every few days, but it's only been a couple of hours here. I think I can help you. Are you sure you want to do this? Maybe you should make peace with your husband." Well, who knows what he said? Leslie shook her head. "No, I need this recording, and then I want you to pass it on to my notary, Alan Smith. He's aware of everything that's going on and will come for it tomorrow morning, and then he'll handle it himself." The department head smiled but still hesitated to ask the question that troubled him. But Leslie already understood what the tall medical chief was concerned about. "William, you don't need to worry about the future of your department. After I'm discharged, I'll make sure that you receive the latest equipment, and we'll also renovate the facade and update the courtyard. In general, I think I can please you and repay you for bringing me back from the brink." The head blushed to the roots of his hair. Truly, some people see right through you. After hesitating for a moment, William remarked, "Actually, you shouldn't be thanking me, but our intern, Edward. I may push him around, but he's a capable guy. Mark my words, someday he'll take my place." Leslie smiled in agreement and closed her eyes in relief. Now, she could rest for a while and gather her thoughts. The next morning, Alfred and his partner, Samantha, were in for a very unpleasant surprise in the form of a police raid, which burst into their house and handcuffed them. As it turned out, the recording made by a hidden camera became irrefutable evidence that Alfred intended to pull off a cunning scheme. Essentially, everything was already prepared, but Lizzie managed to outsmart him and deliver a preemptive strike. Naturally, at the trial, Samantha distanced herself from everything, pretending that she and Alfred had nothing to do with it. However, she still lost her job at the Coastal Hotel. Alfred, of course, would have to face punishment, though not as severe as one might have wished. Realizing that he had failed, the fraudster tried to beg for forgiveness from Lizzie, sending her tearful text messages and passing notes from prison. But the young woman had already made up her mind and decided that her loved ones and acquaintances were waiting for her. Returning from the hospital, she, amidst loud applause from the nurses and midwives, took her triplets from the newborn ward. But she didn't leave the clinic alone. She left with Edward, who volunteered to help her. To the surprise of many, the young intern did this of his own volition, taking one of the babies from the young mother's hands. Edward agreed to pose without further ado for a memorable photo, smiling broadly. Since then, a trusting relationship has been established between him and Lizzie, which eventually leads them to marriage. However, this happened only after Edward completed his internship and became one of the doctors in the intensive care unit, where he was still warmly welcomed by William Dixon. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've covered a lot of ground, and I'm excited to hear what you've learned. What's one key takeaway from this video that you're planning to put into practice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to see how you're going to apply these insights in your own life. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comment and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more content like this. Your support helps us bring more valuable insights your way. See you in the next video.